Hello and welcome to today's WorkSafe Month webinar, Managing Hidden Psychological Injury in the Workplace. I'm Stephanie Morawski from WorkSafe Tasmania and I will be your moderator. Before we start, please take a moment to read the following slide about information received today. I'll now go over housekeeping. Here is a screenshot of the attendee control panel. You should see something that looks like this on the right hand of your screen. You're likely listening in using your computer speaker system by default. If you would prefer to listen over the phone, just select telephone in the audio pane and the dial-in information will be displayed. Webcams and audience microphones will not be used in today's webinar. Questions will be taken at the end of the presentation. Please use the questions pane on your control panel to type and submit your questions. There is also an attendee handout now available for download via your handouts pane. This handout will be referred to during the presentation. Finally, today's webinar is being recorded. I would now like to introduce your presenter, Dr. Kieran Holm from Positive Solutions. Kieran has a PhD in clinical psychology from the University of Tasmania. He is a psychologist and currently works for Tasmanian employee assistance program provider, Positive Solutions, where he provides individual counselling to workers referred through employee assistance programs. Welcome, Kieran.
Thanks so much, Stephanie. Thanks so much for the introduction. Right. So thanks everyone so much for joining me for this webinar. I'm really pleased to be here and it's been fascinating developing this information to present. Really hope you get something out of it. As Stephanie mentioned, I am a psychologist and I work for an organisation called Positive Solutions. So we've been around for almost 30 years. We're a Tasmanian not-for-profit organisation and we offer mediation, counselling and employee assistance program services to a range of different people around Tasmania. And in my role, I specifically provide individual counselling to workers who are referred through employee assistance programs. One of the things that I really enjoy about my work is learning about the many different jobs and industries that people work in. So a little bit about today's webinar. So we'll be focusing on addressing the important and complex issue of hidden psychological injuries in the workplace. And throughout the webinar, I'll be posing a few questions for you to consider. You're most welcome to share your ideas or questions if you like in the chat function. And I'll also, as we go, I'll be mentioning some resources that will provide further information on the topics that we explore today. A little bit of background to the webinar. So workers' compensation provides support to employees who sustain work-related mental health conditions, and workers' compensation data only reflects the incidence of visible psychological injury in the workplace, so the psychological injury that we know about. And there are many employees who experience significant stress and mental health issues at work that delay reporting or don't make a claim for workers' compensation. And today it's really this group of employees that we'll be focusing on. All right, so there's three main goals for today's webinar. The first goal, as you can see on this slide, is really to increase your understanding of how common mental health issues are in the workplace. And this is what we'll sort of focus on to begin with. And I've got a couple of interactive poll questions on this topic too, just to sort of explore a little bit more around that. We'll discuss statistics on mental health issues and workplace psychological injury. We'll look at the idea that workplace psychological injuries can be viewed as being a bit like an iceberg with hidden psychological injuries existing underneath the surface. And I've got a little a picture that sort of illustrates that point as well. The second goal for today's webinar is to look at, I guess, increasing your knowledge around the many negative impacts that workplace psychological injuries can have on employees and organisations, and some of the common barriers that can prevent employees from reporting psychological injuries in the workplace. And lastly, the third goal is really looking at increasing your awareness of the different options that are out there, so different options that are available for managing stress and mental health issues in the workplace. So we'll look at some ideas on prevention and early intervention. We'll be looking at some of the options to reduce the likelihood that workplace psychological injury will occur, and also how to encourage the reporting of workplace psychological injury. So firstly, I've got a poll question for you. So let's start by considering some questions about the incidence of mental health. So we have two multiple choice style poll questions for you to answer if you'd like to, and it'd be really interesting to see your responses. So the first poll, as you can see up there, asks what percentage of Australians are estimated to experience a mental health condition during their lifetime. And if we could please launch the first poll now, Stephanie, that would be great.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
So we'll close the poll shortly. I'll close the poll, Kieran, and share the results.
Thanks so much, Stephanie. All right, so it looks like the majority of people have gone with 45%, followed by 35% and then 15%. All right, and I'll reveal the answers in a couple of slides' time. We'll talk about this a little bit more, but thanks so much for doing that. So the second poll, which we'll get to, there it is. How many workers are estimated to be currently experiencing a mental health condition? And if we could please launch that second poll, Stephanie, that would be fantastic.
We'll close the poll shortly. I'll close the poll, Kieran, and share the results.
Thanks, Stephanie. Cheers. All right, so it looks like 1 in 4 is the popular vote there, followed by 1 in 5 and then 1 in 6. Excellent. Well, thanks so much, everybody who's completed that. That's really interesting results. And now I'll talk a little bit more about this. All right. So according to the Australian Bureau of Statistics, 45% of Australians are estimated to experience a mental health condition during their lifetime. And I guess one way of looking at this, or another way of looking at it, is that it's almost 1 in 2 Australians at some point in their life who are likely to experience a mental health condition. And so, yeah, 45% was the first answer, and 1 in 5 was the second poll answer. So 1 in 5 workers are estimated to currently experience a mental health condition. And here we're talking about mental health conditions in general, so not just mental health conditions that develop due to stresses in the workplace. So I guess one way of looking at this is it means that there's likely to be people that you work with who are currently experiencing mental health issues. So it's important for us to recognise that mental health isn't something that's fixed. It's not black or white, and it can change throughout our lifetime. It's thought to vary on a continuum or a scale. I guess on one side you have positive, healthy functioning, and then through to severe impact on daily functioning at the other. And there's risk factors and also protective factors that can really influence our mental health, and it can move us back and forth along the continuum or scale. So we'll spend some time later exploring some of the risk factors of mental health issues, particularly in regards to the workplace. So I guess a really important question for us to ask is, what is a mental illness? A mental illness is a health problem that significantly affects how a person feels, how they think, behave, and interact with other people. Mental health conditions have a really large impact on a person's functional capacity, which means their ability to do things such as take part in social, work, or family activities. And mental illness ranges in severity, so it can range from mild to through to severe. The most common mental health conditions in Australia are anxiety and depression. In any 1 year, approximately 1 million adults in Australia experience depression, and over 2 million adults in Australia experience anxiety. And importantly, anxiety and depression tend to occur during a person's working years, and less than half of those who experience anxiety and depression seek assistance. Many people with mental health, mental illness manage their condition well with the right supports and treatment. So it's important for us to distinguish between a mental health condition and a psychological injury. So we talked before about how a mental health condition can affect a person's ability to function in a number of different areas in their life. And one of these areas can be at work. So for example, an employee who's experiencing anxiety, they might have difficulty concentrating at work, and they might avoid some work tasks. If an employee has depression, they might be finding that it takes them a bit longer to complete tasks and they struggle when it comes to things like problem solving in the workplace. So psychological injury is a little bit different. So it's a diagnosable mental health disorder which is significantly influenced by work-related factors. So this means that the mental health condition has developed as a result of factors in the workplace. And as you can see on that slide, the statistics indicate that 7,200 Australians are compensated for psychological injuries each year. And 6% of overall workers' compensation claims are relating to psychological injury. And approximately 11% of Comcare claims are for psychological injury. So this is probably personally my favorite slide in terms of the way it looks. So this slide demonstrates the idea that workplace psychological injury can be seen as being a bit like an iceberg. So with an iceberg, the ice above the water is visible from the surface, and below the water, it's hidden from view. This picture compares the ice above the water to the workplace psychological injury that we know about. So in other words, it's been formally reported, and we have statistics through sources such as WorkCover and Comcare because it's been reported. The ice below the water can be compared to the workplace psychological injury that we don't really know about. So it's thought to exist, but it's unreported. So an unreported workplace psychological injury means that no workers' compensation claims been lodged and there's no awareness of the condition by the employer. The employee may be at work and struggling with their condition, or they might be off work on a type of non-compensation leave. According to Safe Work Australia, claim submission rates may not be a true reflection of the actual incidence of psychological injuries. So in other words, going back to that iceberg slide, iceberg comparison, claim submission rates may not give us an accurate idea of how much actually lies beneath the surface. Research suggests that workplace injuries tend to be underreported, but because they aren't formally reported, it's difficult to know the true incidence, with further research really needed. One of the ways that researchers have tried to gain more information about unreported injuries is to give confidential surveys to employees and then match up that information with formally reported data. There was a really interesting study by the University of South Australia in 2017, and it found a large discrepancy, so a large difference between the number of work-reported injuries by hospital employees and their confidential survey results. And this difference really suggested that many injuries were unreported, actually close to 2/3. So quite alarming results. And the study also found that the staff were less likely to report psychological injuries than physical injuries. And there was a survey conducted by the Australian Bureau of Statistics, which found that 1 in 5 employees reported taking time off work over a 12-month period because they felt mentally unwell. Almost half of these employees didn't disclose their reason for taking time off to anybody in their workplace. And lastly, on this slide, it's really important for us to recognise that unreported and delayed reporting of psychological injuries can impact employees' recovery, so it can impact the length and also the effectiveness of employees' recovery. So we'll talk a little bit more now about the impact of psychological injury in the workplace. Psychological injury is an important topic due to the many negative impacts it can have for employees and also organisations. This slide shows some of the negative outcomes of psychological injury that employees can experience. You might be able to think of other outcomes that aren't listed here, and if so, please, you're more than welcome to use the chat feature and we can talk about this a bit more at the end of the webinar. These are just some examples. So psychological injury can understandably impact on somebody's work performance. So an employee might have trouble concentrating or completing tasks. They might not be coming to work, so they might be absent from work. You can see the terms absenteeism and presenteeism on this slide. Absenteeism means being away from work more, and presenteeism is when we work when we're ill. So it's when workers come to work when they're struggling. For example, they might be physically unwell or they might be experiencing mental health issues. And psychological injury can impact upon a person's relationship with others at work and also in their relationships with other people outside of the workplace. So for example, with their family and friends. And I mean, in severe cases, psychological injury can lead to a person losing their job, where they're unable to continue working. They might lose their career and experience ongoing debilitating mental illness. So I guess what this slide shows is that it really is an important thing for us to be focusing on. And this slide here shows some of the negative outcomes of psychological injury, and it's more from an organisational perspective. So this includes outcomes such as higher turnover of staff and the associated costs in recruiting and training new staff, lost productivity, increased absenteeism, presenteeism, so in other words, staff being away from work more or attending the workplace but performing not at their best or their usual. Poor team dynamics or relationships. So for example, there might be low morale or conflict within teams. And financial costs. So things like there's the cost of counselling and other support services and workers' compensation costs. So one question you might be asking is, if psychological injury can lead to so many negative outcomes, why is it often so unreported in the workplace? And I think that's a fair question. So there's many different reasons, and it's going to vary depending on the person and their situation. This isn't an exhaustive list, and you might be able to think of some other reasons that aren't listed here. And if you can think of any reasons that aren't up here on this slide, please feel free to use the chat feature, and I'd be really, really interested to hear your ideas. So an employee might be concerned about how reporting a psychological injury might affect their current employment. So for example, the idea of not being considered for a promotion or not being able to take on particular tasks. They might be worried about things like how the injury could affect future career options in other organisations. They could be worried about the stigma associated with mental health issues. So for example, being treated differently by others at work. Due to the, I guess, the hidden nature of the injury, the unseen nature of the injury, they might be unsure if they'll be believed by others in the workplace or concerned that they'll be seen as exaggerating the injury. Employees might not have much awareness, I guess, around the process of reporting psychological injury. So for example, how they can go about reporting and also where they can go to seek help. They might worry about things like the injury deteriorating due to the stresses of reporting. So for example, there might be concerns around managing disputes or privacy concerns. And there could be many different feelings that prevent people from reporting. So some feelings that I can think of are things like fear, guilt, shame, blame, or somebody might feel quite helpless about their situation, like there's no hope or no way out of the situation that they're in. Now we'll talk a little bit about what an employee can do to manage a mental health issue. So this slide shows some of the options available to employees within their workplace, and we'll talk about these options in a bit more detail in some of the following slides. So the first option up there is confiding about the issue to somebody in the workplace. So this might be a trusted supervisor or a trusted colleague or mentor, somebody basically that the employee feels comfortable with. The employee may wish to notify their employer of potential risks to developing psychological injury, and we'll talk a little bit more about these risks shortly. But that might be things like unrealistic demands, lack of support, poor relationships within the workplace, or there might be issues around bullying or harassment. Some organisations have an employee assistance program, and this is where employees can speak to a counsellor for short-term assistance managing personal or work-related issues. So for some people, accessing a service like this might be an option. And there's also the option for some of workplace mediation or workplace facilitation, which can be an option for employees who wish to manage disputes or problems that might be contributing to the stress they're experiencing in the workplace. So if an employee is experiencing a mental health issue, they might wish to attend a general practitioner for treatment. If somebody's struggling with a mental health issue, GPs can be a really good point of contact and provide information and referrals for further assistance. The GP might refer them to see a psychologist through a mental health care plan, where some of the cost is reimbursed by Medicare. If the employee has experienced a psychological injury at work, they might seek treatment for the injury through their GP and apply for workplace rehabilitation and compensation, which involves providing their employer with a signed workers' compensation medical certificate and a workers' compensation claim form. If you're interested in any more information about this process, WorkSafe has on their website have quite a lot of information about the process. And other options for an employee experiencing mental health issues include things such as assistance through, say, a psychiatrist, or accessing counselling privately, or accessing relevant support services, for example, services that support people to manage addiction such as alcohol or drug use. As we talked about before, some organisations offer their staff access to an employee assistance program, which is short-term counselling support service for employees. You might have come across the term return on investment, and this is a term that is really used for what do businesses get out of investing into a service? So what do they get out of putting into something? So studies suggest that employee assistance programs provide significant return on investment to organisations by reducing the rate of presenteeism. So by accessing an employee assistance program, there's a number of benefits for an employee. Employee assistance programs can assist an employee to help manage workplace stress and mental health issues, which could then therefore prevent psychological injury. So in other words, by accessing employee assistance programs, the worker basically takes control of their situation before it becomes a workers' compensation issue. One of the benefits of accessing employee assistance programs is also that employees get no cost free sessions each year for assisting them with a variety of different issues, personal or work-related issues. Employee assistance programs are designed to support people to manage a broad range of issues. So, for example, these are just some ideas, but supporting people who are struggling with mental health issues such as anxiety and depression, supporting people who provide care for others, and people who are experiencing things like grief, loss, or managing separation. And the sessions can help people cope with issues at work. So it might be issues in work-life balance, managing workplace stress, or managing after there's been a serious incident occurring at work. An employee assistance program is a confidential service, so it's a safe and objective space for people to talk about their issues. And for those that attend, they attend voluntarily. So it means that the decision is entirely up to them. It can also be really responsive. So in urgent situations, the first appointment can often be within 48 hours. And an employee assistance program is a safety net for those who don't report psychological injury for some of the reasons we talked about before. So we talked before about workplace mediation and facilitation, and these can be useful options if an employee is experiencing significant work stress due to conflict or if there's been changes within their workplace. This slide outlines some of the main differences between workplace mediation and workplace facilitation. Pretty much the key difference between these two concepts is whether or not there's been a dispute between the parties that are involved. So workplace mediation, it's collaborative and it helps parties resolve issues that are in dispute. It's voluntary and it's a confidential process. And I guess the idea is that mediators are impartial, so they're helping the parties to reach fair and workable agreements. And these agreements are consistent with policies in the workplace and the relevant legislation. So I think a pretty good example of workplace mediation is where there's two colleagues and they're having quite a bit of difficulty working together due to a breakdown in their working relationship. So workplace facilitation is a bit different. So it's a process where there's issues of mutual concern and it's facilitated by somebody who's impartial and objective. So the aim of workplace facilitation is to help a group through a problem-solving process so that they can reach a joint decision. So generally there's no dispute between the parties. And I think a good example of workplace facilitation is where an employer is considering changes in work practices and they want a group discussion to arrive at a decision that works for everybody. So it's a collaborative process and the parties would be working together on a shared problem. Some organisations conduct workplace mediation and workplace facilitation internally, and this might be through their human resources section. And sometimes organisations refer workers to an external agency that specialise in these areas. If you're interested in finding out more information about this, fairwork.gov.au has some more information on workplace mediation, and they also have some videos on their website as well. So this slide talks a bit about how we can go about speaking up at work if we're experiencing a mental health issue. I'm not sure if anybody's come across the website Heads Up, but if you go to headsup.org.au, so headsup.org.au, they've got some more ideas on how to share a mental health issue with others in the workplace. So I encourage you to check out their website if you're interested in more information. So it's important to consider the right to privacy in the workplace. An employee may wish to consider, I guess, who they want to share personal information with and how much information they wish to share. And if they want the person they share the information with to pass on any information to others in the workplace. It's probably important to mention that by law, employers must respect an employee's right to privacy, except in cases where the employer has a good reason to believe that the condition affects workplace safety. The person might like to plan what they'll be saying, what they'd like to say. So I guess the idea is just thinking a bit about the issue, how it might be affecting their work, and if there's any, I guess, workplace stresses that could be impacting upon their condition. Some people find it helpful to plan the conversation with some assistance from others. So it might be assistance from a friend, a family member, or a health professional. And it can also be worth considering how the workplace might be able to provide some support. So, are there some tasks that need to be adjusted, adjustments to workload or work schedule? So we've talked about some of the options employees can take in the workplace to manage their own mental health. And now we're kind of moving into the second part of the webinar, which is really looking at spending a bit more time looking at some of the options that organisations can take to manage mental health issues in the workplace. So now we're looking at things more from an organisational level, from more of a management perspective. And some of the options are things like increasing mental health awareness in the workplace, addressing workplace stresses, developing an organisational mental health policy, and managing workplace bullying. So I'd like to just pause here for a short period of time, and I'll just mention some resources that kind of follow on from these ideas if you're interested in finding some more information on options for organisations to manage mental health in the workplace. So Safe Work Australia, they have some really interesting documents on this topic. So one of the documents is called Preventing Psychological Injury under WHS Laws. So Preventing Psychological Injury under WHS Laws, which can be found on their website. And they also have a really useful and very recent and I guess applicable worksheet, info sheet to the current COVID-19 pandemic. So it's called Preventing Psychological Injury at Work During COVID-19. So preventing psychological injury at work during COVID-19. And finally, I'll also mention that WorkSafe Victoria has produced a document that can be really useful for employers on these issues. So it's called Preventing and Managing Work-Related Stress. It's a guidebook for employers. So Preventing and Managing Work-Related Stress, a guidebook for employers. And now we'll just talk about these issues in a little bit more detail. So one option is for organisations to, I guess, consider increasing mental health awareness within the workplace. This can benefit the organisation by decreasing stigma about mental health and also increasing the likelihood that employees will report psychological issues earlier, I guess, before their symptoms deteriorate and have a greater impact. An approach that increases mental health awareness in the workplace can be really useful in preventing psychological injuries from occurring. There's a few different ways that mental health awareness can be developed. So it can be through education. So for example, it might be that a workplace has some information sessions. They might be on a variety of topics depending on the needs of the organisation, but it might be information sessions, for example, on workplace stress, mental health issues. It might be other things such as coping, self-care, resilience, and I guess if applicable, it might be on managing conflict at work, things like that. So yeah, through education. Mental health awareness can also be developed by providing accessible information to staff. So an example of this would be by putting up posters and having brochures distributed in the workplace, in particular areas where people might congregate on mental health awareness and available support services. So it might be brochures on, how to get in contact with an employee assistance program provider or another relevant service. If you're interested in obtaining brochures in the workplace, I'll mention once again HeadsUp, so headsup.org.au. They've developed a number of excellent resources that are available that relate specifically to workplace mental health. And just lastly on this point, so managers can also I guess, look at increasing their own understanding of stress and mental health issues. And the idea behind this is that by doing so, it can help them gain the skills to recognise when an employee might be struggling, and also, I guess, how they might be able to go about approaching them on such a sensitive topic. So a question you might be asking is, how do we know whether somebody is struggling with a mental health issue at work? What kind of things can I look for? And this slide shows some of the common indicators of mental health issues at work. So firstly, it talks a little bit about difficulty functioning at work. So people can experience high levels of anxiety. They might have lost concentration. That idea of presenteeism, where they're turning up to work but really struggling with working and with work tasks. Another indicator of mental health issue is time off work. So if there's been significant time off work, somebody might find that they're preoccupied with a problem. So they might be really focused in on a particular problem. Loss of self-confidence is another one. And feeling stressed, irritable, angry about things that I guess wouldn't normally bother somebody, but becomes, I guess, a really important issue to them. Other things are, other indicators of mental health issues at work are things like relationship stress. So it might be relationship issues with co-workers, colleagues. It might be use of alcohol or drugs in the workplace. Somebody might be feeling more sensitive or vulnerable. They might be avoiding social situations or even avoiding certain work tasks. And an important indicator to mention is if there's been a major personal crisis or a traumatic event. So with this webinar, we've included a PDF handout which talks about, I guess, some of the things to look out for in terms of signs of stress, and also some of the things that we can do to go about managing stress in our lives. We also have some fact sheets on our website, which is www.positivesolutions.com.au, and the fact sheets are really about anxiety and depression. So it also talks a bit about some of the common symptoms people can experience, and some ideas around coping and getting help with those issues. So another option for an organisation to manage mental health issues in the workplace is to address workplace stresses. People can experience work-related stress if they're exposed to hazards in their workplace. And one way of looking at this is it's a bit like how people can get physical injuries if they're exposed to hazards at work. Some of the factors that can contribute to work-related stress are things like job demand. So it might be high job demand or low job demand. It might be lack of role clarity. So lack of clarity, sort of ambiguity, I guess, in somebody's work role. If there's significant workplace conflict, can contribute to work-related stress. If an employee is not involved in decisions, that can also be a contributor. Low levels of support from management, and like I sort of mentioned a little bit about before, critical workplace incidents. So if somebody's been exposed to traumatic events, that can also be a contributing factor to work-related stress. So stress is our normal, natural response to dangerous or challenging situations that we can experience, and it's a really normal part of our lives. But if work-related stress is high, or if it continues over time, a person might develop work-related psychological injury. So for example, somebody might develop anxiety or depression due to significant work stress. And when we're experiencing stress, our body can respond in many different ways. So we might have difficulty sleeping, we might feel more fatigued, experience muscle tension, and there might be other issues like headaches or nausea. And we can also experience changes in our thoughts, our feelings, and behavior when we're under stress. So we might find ourselves worrying more than usual, feeling overwhelmed, or like we've lost control. Or we might find ourselves being a bit snappier with others or avoiding people. So there's a number of different ways that organisations can go about the idea of addressing workplace stress, workplace stresses. And these are just ideas. If you're interested in further information, there's a link down the bottom to Beyond Blue. So they have a resource called Developing a Workplace Mental Health Strategy, a how-to guide for organisations. And that's got quite a bit more information on this topic. So organisations might wish to look at things like, I guess, increasing the clarity of employees' roles so that they understand the scope and, or better understand the scope and responsibilities of their job. Things like regularly reviewing and addressing workload issues. So it might be that there's really demanding workloads or unrealistic deadlines, so unachievable tasks. Might be that there's issues within communication in the team. So having regular communication with the team can help the team to be aware of important changes before they occur and help them through the process of change. There's also the idea of providing workers with the things they need to safely do their jobs. So it can be things like resources, information, training. Improving workplace culture through good leadership is another way of addressing workplace stresses. So this can really be about demonstrating support and understanding. There's so many different benefits of a mentally healthy workplace. So things like increased productivity, engagement, and reduced conflict and absenteeism. And just lastly on this topic, an organisation might wish to develop a mental health policy to provide guidance on how to manage mental health issues in the workplace. Another option for managing mental health issues in the workplace is to consider the issue of workplace bullying. So workplace bullying is an occupational hazard. It refers to repeated unreasonable behaviour that creates a risk to health and safety. So for example, or I guess in other words, risk of psychological or physical injury. There's a range of different behaviours that bullying can encompass. So some of these behaviours, things like abusive, insulting or offensive comments, receiving unjustified criticism or complaints, spreading misinformation or malicious rumours, aggressive, intimidating behaviour, violence or threat of violence, setting unreasonable requirements for tasks or deadlines, practical jokes or belittling or humiliating comments. There's a number of ways organisations can go about reducing the risk of workplace bullying. So for example, this can be done through regular consultation with workers and OH&S representatives to find out if bullying is occurring in the workplace or whether or not there's a risk of bullying occurring down the track. It can also be reduced through things like setting behavioural standards through code of conduct and workplace bullying policies, designing safe systems of work by clearly defining jobs and providing workers with the resources, the information and training they need to do their job safely, and also developing and implementing workplace bullying reporting and procedures for a response. Just a few other options here in terms of reducing, managing workplace bullying. So organisations can also look at developing productive and respectful workplace relationships through management practices, so good management practices, and through communication, providing information and training on workplace bullying policies and procedures, and available support and assistance and how to prevent and respond to workplace bullying, and prioritising measures that foster and protect the psychological health of employees. So we're getting towards the end of the webinar today. Thanks for staying with me. So this slide here provides some information, some ideas on how to have a difficult or sensitive conversation with an employee about changes in their mood or their behaviour. And yeah, once again, if you're interested in finding out a bit more, I would recommend headsup.org.au. So one of the ideas is, I guess, planning the conversation. So considering what kind of supports are available within the organisation and also outside of the organisation, and I guess considering things such as, when's the best time and place to have this this difficult, sensitive conversation with an employee. Also, there's the idea of approaching and starting a conversation by saying what feels comfortable and really focusing specifically on changes in the employee's behaviour. So any changes that have been noticed can be a good starting point in having that conversation. And then really using listening skills, so having relaxed body language, things like maintaining eye contact, showing the person that you're hearing them through repeating back what you've heard, those sorts of ideas, and responding. So considering the employee's individual needs and what can you do to support them. So it might be adjustments in the workplace that are needed, or if appropriate, the manager might wish to assist the employee to make a referral to an employee assistance program. I should also mention that sometimes managers need support. So there's also a specialised employee assistance program service that's designed to support managers called Manager Assist. And these are services where where the manager can talk to a trained counsellor who also has managerial experience. So as we near the end of today's webinar, let's just reflect a little bit on some of the main points from what we've discussed. So hidden psychological injury in the workplace is a really complex issue, and it can be difficult to understand because it's underreported. Workplace psychological injury can be compared to an iceberg. So if you think back to that iceberg comparison slide, claim submission rates may not give us an accurate idea of how much actually lies beneath the surface. So really there's further research that's needed to provide more information about really the incidence and the nature of underreporting. As we talked about before, there's many barriers to reporting psychological injuries, but steps can be taken to encourage employees to report. So for example, steps such as increasing mental health awareness in the workplace. And lastly, workplace stresses can be addressed to develop a mentally healthy workplace and to prevent psychological injury. If you're interested in finding out more information after this webinar about any of the topics we've discussed, there's some websites on this slide that might be useful. So Beyond Blue is really looking at mental health in general. Heads Up looks more at mental health specifically in the workplace. But there's also some other sites that are really quite useful on these topics. So Safe Work Australia, Comcare, and Fair Work Australia. So thanks again for joining me today, and I look forward to hearing your ideas and questions, and thanks for staying with me. Much appreciated.
Thanks, Kieran. So we'll now take audience questions. So please use the questions pane on your control panel to type and submit your questions for Kieran today. A comment that has come through, Kieran, that you may wish to respond to, it is a clear and transparent issue resolution process is essential as well. The capability for genuine confidential reporting to a third party where needed. This enables staff to report without fear of retribution.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point. So would you mind just reading that out again, please, Stephanie?
Absolutely. A clear and transparent issue resolution process is essential as well. The capability for genuine confidential reporting to a third party where needed. This enables staff to report without fear of retribution.
I think that's a really important point. I don't really have much to add to that, but I think that's a really good idea. Definitely. So yeah, clear and transparent issue, resolution process. Definitely. Nice.
All right, thanks,
Thanks for
thanks,
sharing
Kieran.
your idea. No problem.
A question: what happens when
Yeah, sure.
HR are driving the bullying?
Yeah, that's a really important point. So when HR are driving the bullying, and I guess just like with bullying, it can come from any department. So I think when HR is driving the bullying, if that's kind of what's going on, the thing that I would recommend is checking out specifically Fair Work Australia. So sometimes people find that they're in a situation where they're being exposed to bullying or harassment, and they feel that they're unable to kind of really get on top of that in terms of in the workplace. So there's actually some other resources out there outside of the workplace. So Fair Work Australia can actually put in an order to stop bullying in the workplace. So talking to somebody who works there might be a good place to start.
All right, thanks, Kieran.
No problem.
And just to remind everyone, there is still time for questions during today's webinar, so please use the questions pane on your control panel for those questions. And just to remind everyone, webinars are running during WorkSafe month up until the 30th of October, so do head to the WorkSafe tasmonth.com.au website and register for any other sessions that we are running. Kieran, are people able to
Yes.
get a copy of your slides? So the webinar is being recorded and will be made available at the end of WorkSafe month on our YouTube page and our website. But if people
Hmm,
wanted a copy of
that's totally fine.
your, okay, um,
Yeah, definitely.
in
I'm not sure how to organise that, but I mean, I could always provide it to WorkSafe Tas, and you know, welcome to distribute it if you want. Or I'm not sure if there's another way of going about it.
no,
Um,
absolutely. So we can with that we can certainly email Kieran's presentation to anyone who attended today. And just to remind everyone as well, if you haven't downloaded the stress management fact sheet, it is still there in your handouts pane to download as well. So a question that has come through, Kieran, would you
yeah,
agree that a good mentally healthy workplace is to address inappropriate behaviour early before it progresses to bullying to prevent movement along the continuum to the injury point?
I think that's so well put. Yeah, definitely. I think that's definitely a major component of creating a good mentally healthy workplace. Definitely, and that idea of, I guess, preventing psychological injury from occurring. So I think that's a really great, really articulate way of putting it. So thank you.
Thank you, Kieran. And you've had some comments come through. Thank you very much. I appreciate the quality of the presentation. And
Oh,
again,
thank you.
I have taken a lot away from this.
Oh, that's
So
great. I'm really pleased to hear that.
another question, I have great difficulty managing in a context where I have to guess what may or may not help. And it seems difficult to get information from the person's psychologist or psychiatrist. I can understand wanting to be careful about their privacy and relationship, but
Mm,
is there a good way to work around this?
sure. I think that's a really interesting point. I think one way of working around this might be, because I mean there is that, like we talked about earlier in the presentation, that need to you know, be careful with confidentiality in the workplace, privacy, and there's legal requirements around that. But I think you know, one idea might be actually you know, having that conversation with the staff member and seeing you know, how much are they willing for you to be involved in that process, because you know, there might be some way where you still are able to receive some information, but I guess about their, say, their treatment, but with the permission of the staff member. So yeah, I think maybe one way of going about that is really approaching the staff member and just seeing if how they feel about that, and yeah, and if that might be appropriate in that situation.
All right, thanks, Kieran. And there's still time to submit questions via your questions pane for Kieran to answer about his webinar today. So a question, Kieran, how do you deal with management who don't believe in mental health issues?
Oh, how do you deal with management who don't believe in mental health? Who don't, sorry, believe? Was it believe in mental
Yes,
health issues?
who don't believe.
Mm. I think that's kind of stumped me, to be honest. I think there's I guess one of the ideas would be around, there's that kind of lack of awareness, it sounds like, from management. So it might be around almost instigating, trying to get some kind of survey or something that kind of taps into the incidence, I guess, of mental health issues in the workplace. Um, yeah, I think it could be quite a difficult one, because in some ways I think it kind of starts with management, kind of feeding down to employees. But I think, you know, if they're able to kind of get some evidence, I guess, or something objective that kind of shows that this is an issue, that might be more helpful. So yeah, sorry, I can't really answer that. You've stumped me a bit, but it's an excellent question.
Thanks, Kieran. Another question. What do you do when a colleague has had toxic behaviour for years, but management have not acted?
Yeah, so once again, I would I think in that situation, if everything's been done as much as you can do internally, so within the organisation, and it's not getting any further, a really good point of contact would be Fair Work Australia. So they really specialise in providing information, resources in relation to those sorts of questions.
Thanks, Kieran.
No problem.
A statement and a statement and a question next. I
Sure.
find your I find your suggestion of developing a mental health policy for the workplace an interesting idea, and we'll be pursuing this. Have you
All
any
right.
advice? Have you any advice on how this has been introduced in workplaces and the do's and don'ts for this process from your experience?
Oh, wow. Yeah, to be honest, not so much. I've never, actually um, gone about developing a mental health policy. It hasn't really come up in my work specifically. But I do know that there are some really great resources out there that do actually give you a lot of good ideas about how to go about developing a mental health policy step by step. So I would suggest, I'm pretty sure WorkSafe Tas would most likely have information on that. And probably also Safe Work Australia. I'd definitely recommend checking them out because they've got a lot of information on those sorts of websites that can kind of take you through it a bit more step by step in a kind of, I guess, a practical managerial type approach. Um, yeah, there's some really useful documents out there.
Thanks, Kieran.
No
And
problem.
another question. How do
Oh, yeah.
you manage how do you manage or support managers who feel mental health of their staff aren't their problem? It is the OHS team's problem to fix. So I'll repeat that question. How do you
Thank you. Yes.
manage how do you manage or support managers who feel mental health of their staff aren't their problem? It is the OHS
Mm,
team's problem to fix.
mm, mm, It's a really important point. I think once again, it probably goes back to that idea around trying to really increase mental health awareness in the workplace. So, if there are some kind of sessions, information sessions that can be sort of introduced into the workplace on this kind of topic, and kind of showing that managers can, they do have a pretty big role to play, and the sorts of things that they can do. I think sometimes having information sessions like that could be quite useful, as well as, so I mentioned before, Heads Up, which look at really mental health in the workplace. So they've actually got some resources that specifically are targeted to managers, and I guess the sorts of things they can do to support their staff's mental health in the workplace. So I think kind of yeah, sort of approaching some of those resources, and that might be quite useful in terms of that that question. Thanks.
All right, thanks, Kieran. And there's still time to submit your questions via the questions pane for Kieran today. And just to remind everyone that WorkSafe will send out a copy of Kieran's PowerPoint presentation, which does include a number of the websites which he has referred to, including WorkSafe Tasmania, Safe Work Australia, Heads Up, and Safe Work Victoria as well. So a statement that has come through, Kieran, which we may wish
Oh,
to
great.
respond
Thank you.
to. Management would be in breach of the Work Health and Safety Act if they failed to manage psychological injuries and risk within the organisation.
Mm, that's that's really interesting. Um, so management would be in breach if they fail to. So what was that last part that you said?
Yes, so management would be in breach of the Work Health and Safety Act if they fail to manage psychological injuries and risk within the organisation.
I wonder what an example of that could be where they've failed to to manage those issues. But yeah, I think that's a really appropriate statement. I don't really have too much more to add to that. But thank you. Thanks for sharing that with us.
Thank you, Kieran. Another statement has come
Oh, yep,
through as well, Kieran.
no problem.
Policy. Okay, so the statement is policy would define ownerships and responsibilities. This would
Mm,
cover OH&S and managers.
hmm Yep. And I think that's a really important point. So if there's a mental health policy that's been developed within an organisation, then it would be developed according to, I guess, legislation, and it'd be a really good, solid source to kind of have moving forward to manage workplace mental health issues. Yeah.
Thanks, Kieran. A question. I think there's not enough. Yep, I think there's not enough awareness made within my workplace on this. What's the best
Mm,
way? What's the best way for awareness or to create awareness?
hmm So one of the common ways that people can create awareness is, and it might sound pretty straightforward, but I'm guessing a lot of organisations don't really do this, is really providing some information in some way or another about mental health issues. So yeah, like I kind of mentioned earlier, um, if it's I guess applicable, having some brochures or posters, things like that in the workplace. It might be from Beyond Blue or Heads Up or whoever, um, provides the relevant information. That kind of thing can go a pretty long way. So, having some kind of brochures, posters, I think also definitely there's that idea around having information sessions. So it might be information on, sometimes information sessions might be on workplace bullying, they might be on conflict resolution, or they might be on specifically on like workplace stress. But I think sometimes just having those sorts of avenues can be a good way of, I guess, encouraging people to talk about these issues a bit more. And it's actually not that uncommon currently for organisations to put into place some practices like that.
All right, thanks, Kieran. And a comment has come through, which is saying that this would be helpful, hopefully, for our listeners. But Beyond Blue provides some great resources that workplaces can tap into and gain support
Mm.
for workplaces seeking to develop a mentally healthy workplace. So that web address is beyondblue.org.au. If you head to the About Us section, there is a page on workplace mental health.
That's fantastic. Thanks so much for sharing that. I should also mention that a lot of, so like I had to draw upon a lot of different resources for this webinar, and I mentioned some of the key ones on the final slide. But one thing I've noticed is, I guess because of the current issues surrounding the COVID-19 pandemic, there's been a lot more information coming out, and some of the information relates directly um, to, I guess, managing mental health in the current climate. So yeah, there's been a lot of new developments in terms of the information that's out there more recently due to the current situation that we find ourselves in worldwide.
All right, thank you, Kieran. And on that note, we'll start to wrap up. But just to let you know again, there's another comment has come through. A great
Thank you.
presentation. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. Much appreciated. And thanks really so much for people that have asked the questions and shared some information. And even if you didn't sort of ask anything or share any information, thanks just so much for watching or listening, or however you want to say it. But thank you.
All right, thanks, Kieran. And just a final reminder, the stress management fact sheet is still available to download before we do close today's presentation. And WorkSafe will also send out attendees a copy of Kieran's PowerPoint today, which he has listed a number of sites which you can go to, including Safe Work Australia, WorkSafe Tasmania, WorkSafe Victoria, and also Heads Up.
Thank you.
So thank you, Dr. Kieran Holm from Positive Solutions, and thank you everyone for attending today's webinar, Managing Hidden Psychological Injury in the Workplace. Once you do leave today's webinar, you will receive a survey on the presentation. We do appreciate you providing us with your feedback. Today's webinar has also been recorded and will be made available at the end of WorkSafe month on the WorkSafe YouTube page and also on the WorkSafe Tasmania website. On behalf of WorkSafe Tasmania and the WorkCover Tasmania board, thank you for joining us, and thank you, Kieran.
Thank you.